Today I'm going to show you what's inside of a Jeep Wrangler's automatic transmission and how it works. Now this is an 8-speed 850RE transmission out of a 2018 Jeep JL Wrangler. Now the input from the engine would come from this side here under the bell housing through the torque converter, and its output would be at the back here to the transfer case, which would lead to the wheels. Now over here on the passenger side, not much to see. We just have a hookup for the transmission control module located inside the transmission. Then over here on the driver's side, you have the two lines here that will go to the transmission cooler up at the front. Here's the manual shift selector for your park, reverse, neutral, drive. We've got a fluid vent over here, and this is the splined output shaft that goes to the transfer case. Now over here inside, this is where the torque converter would be. I've already removed it, and this is the input shaft that goes to the transmission. Alright, so since automatic transmissions are one of the wonders of the world, I'm just going to start taking stuff apart here. Here we've got a bunch of T50s that go all the way around for the oil pump. Since I can't get the front pump out, I'm going to start at the bottom here. Now what's interesting about this pan here is that there's no drain port on the bottom of the pan, and you pretty much have to do a pan drop in order to get all the fluid out. I don't know what they're thinking, if this is a Volkswagen or something with all the torques. Alright, so I went under the bed here and I found my old pants and popped that under there because I'm pretty sure there's going to be a bit of a mess when I drop this pan. Hey, no mess. I did strain 6 quarts out of this thing. Now this transmission pan is pretty heavy and feels pretty durable. The transmission filter is actually integrated into the pan here. Alright, we're starting to make a big mess here, so in comes the pants to soak that up. Underneath here we have the valve body, which is essentially the brains of this transmission. Here you can see a bunch of solenoids across here, and they're going to control the fluid inside of this valve body to turn on and off clutches in the transmission to switch gears. Over here we've got a big accumulator and the high impulse solenoid that works under engine start stop. There's a lot of T30 torques here, but some of them hold the valve body to itself and some of them hold it to the case. I'm just going to start zipping all these off and see what happens. So there's a couple of T40s in here. Pull out this accumulator here. Whoa, it's heavy. It probably has fluid inside. There we go. This seems to hold all of the solenoid connections here. Yep. And that comes out. Alright, so now with the valve body out of the way, I can give this a little tap here. Of course it's going to happen off camera, but I turned the transmission on its side here and everything fell down. So here I've pulled out part of the first planetary gear set along with the oil pump. Here we have the input and output over here from that fluid pump. Now on the back of this fluid pump here, we had a ring gear, which is this one here for the first planetary gear set, and the B clutch, which sat over it. Now the clutch itself has these bands over here that are externally teeth, and then we have these friction discs inside of here that are internally teeth. That's going to lock this here to the transmission casing when it's activated. Now if I remove this ring gear here for that B clutch, we have the A clutch inside of here, and you can see that's a little bit smaller. Now going back to the V clutch here, we have the return spring, and that helps to return the springs when the clutch is deactivated. There you go. This is the piston. You can see it's got a seal on the inside here. This entire thing is going to fill with fluid when you activate it. I'm going to try to remove the snap rings over here. Everyone hates snap rings. There you go. And now I can remove the A clutch. Here you can see we've also got the bands and clutches. These are the bands here that are externally teethed, and these friction clutches which are internally teethed. And here you can see we're splined to the outside of this pump. What is cool is that this here drives the fluid pump, so whenever your engine is idling, this thing is going to be rotating. And you can see inside of here it's actually a chain drive. Taking a look further inside here, this is the parking pawl mechanism that's going to lock the final drive as it goes out to the tail shaft. There we go. This is the parking pawl over here that's going to actuate your final drive. It's spring loaded. And to get that little parking pawl out, there's a hex on the outside here. I actually thought this was for fluid drain. Maybe it is. Oh, cool. Little piston pops out. And then I can pull out the parking pawl. This little tooth over here is all that's preventing your vehicle from rolling away when you're in park. That's why you should use your handbrakes. Taking a look inside of the transmission, we have our P1 and further back P2 planetary gear sets that's going to come out next. And this input shaft looks like it wants to come out. And looking inside of here, we've got my favorite, more snap rings. Alright, so after a lot of cooking, I was able to get that snap ring loose. I hate snap rings. Now I can pull out this P1 planetary gear. You can see the planetary gear set. And this is the carrier, which is externally splined. Here we have a shared sun gear between P1 and P2. And this is the planetary gear 2. It's coming out with a bunch of clutches. If we take a look at what we just took out there, this is the P1 planet carrier. You can see it's externally splined to something inside the transmission. The ring gear for this planetary gear set is what we took off earlier and is on the oil pump. Here's the sun gear. This is going to be for this gear and for this one as well. which is P2. Now you can see this here is the external splines of the transmission, and P1's carrier is actually not splined to that, but just to this big drum here, which is going to lead to the planet carrier of P4, which is way down inside of here. There's a total of 4 planetary gear sets in this transmission. All right, we're going to pull this P2 apart here. Here you can see P2's planet carriers, and here's the ring gear for P2. And the sun gear that's going to connect to P3, which is inside of here. Here's how the input shaft works here. To turn on clutches A and B, all you got to do is send some fluid from the valve body into one hole. It's going to come out through the other hole where that piston is located, and that's going to turn on and off that clutch. Likewise, on the other side of the input shaft here, you can see there's a lot of other holes drilled into here to turn on a bunch of other clutches down the road. Now let's try to make sense of this. So over here we've got our planet carrier number 3. We already took out the sun gear, which is connected to the ring gear of the previous planetary gear set. The outside of this here is splined to the previous ring gear, and the outside of it also connects to the D clutch over here, and the output on the middle here becomes the sun gear of your P4 planetary gear set at the back of the transmission. Inside of here we have our E clutch and our C clutch. So we're going to go ahead and remove this other snap ring. Hopefully this is a lot easier. So these guys are trying to make things a little smart here by putting this little dot here. When you try to take out this snap ring over here, it kind of hits that dot. It's not easy to take out. So we're going to have to do some prying action here. Another stupid snap ring. Alright, here's the planet carrier of P3. See, it's got its external splines to the housing over here. I can take off this cage over here. And then we have another cage over here, which is going to house our E clutch and C clutch. Of course, I found another snap ring on the inside here. Oh, we got a ring gear for P3. You can see that was splined to this housing over here. And we have another snap ring. This one wasn't as difficult. Another one for the collection. Here we have our E clutch. Here we have a thrust washer. And there's your C clutch, and here's the housing. Now one of the reasons why you have thrust washers and snap rings is because these gears here are cut on a slant. You can see they're not straight, and they're just kind of on an angle here. That significantly reduces gear noise, but it also produces a force along the axial direction here, and that's what your washers and snap rings have to work against. Now taking a look at these two clutches here, E and C, you'll see that E here is actually splined to the input shaft, whereas this one here is just freewheeling. Now as a quick reminder to how a clutch set works, we have the steels on the inside here, and you can see those are splined to this entire pack over here, which is in turn splined to the input shaft over here. The outside over here is splined to this housing thing over here, which in turn is splined to that sun gear. Now when you want to lock up this input shaft over here relative to the sun gear at the back over here, all you have to do is apply fluid pressure through these little holes inside of here from the holes on the shaft. Now once you apply a little fluid pressure to the correct hole here, it's going to go to this housing inside of here, which is essentially a piston. It's going to fill up with fluid, and you'll see here that there's a bit of gap between here. Well, that fluid is actually going to force these to be together, and that's going to lock up. When it unlocks, of course, the steels are going to be locked to the housing, but these friction bands are now free to rotate, and you can have relative motion between the input here and the output over here. Now of course there is a little bit of inefficiency here, because as these friction bands are rotating over here and the two elements are rotating relative to each other, there is a bit of drag, and I can definitely feel that, and that's why automatic transmissions are not that efficient. Here's a quick exploded view of how those clutches work. Of course they're all externally splined here. The internal ones here are splined to this barrel, then outside of that we have this barrel, which is splined to these guys over here, and then outside this entire thing we're going to see next, there's going to be and then outside the entire thing here we're going to be splined to the P4. You also notice that this entire transmission is laid out in one line because it is a rear wheel drive longitudinally based transmission. Of course, if you have a front wheel drive transaxle, you're going to have planetary gear sets and then a counter shaft and then a final drive kind of compacted in a front wheel drive layout. Alright, looking down inside of here, you can see we have the final barrel on the outside here that's going to control P4's planetary gear set. Obviously I can't remove this because there's another clutch pack at the back there called clutch C. Now I have another snap ring, which please wish me that I can get it out because it's way down inside of there. Let's see if we can get this snap ring out of here after a long try. Alright, now I'm just going to turn the transmission upside down, see what comes out. And basically we have the clutch and bands from clutch number C. The piston is still stuck inside. Alright, so I took off this rear seal here. And of course I gotta wipe down all this stuff here with my old work pants. Well, I actually got it out with snap ring pliers this time. That was probably the hardest snap ring, and it was external. Now I can take the rest of the transmission guts out. Here we've got a barrel, and it's coming out with the output shaft. All you've got left in there is a bearing that's pressed into the transmission casing. Alright, taking a look at this final piece here, looking inside here, you can see we have the external splines here that are going to spline the D clutch, which we just took apart. And then we have the outside here, which is this giant barrel, which is splined to the ring of P4. On the back side here, the planet carrier is what's connected directly to the output clutch, which goes to the transfer case. And then on that carrier, we've also got these little teeth here, which is what's going to engage your parking pawl on the final drive. That's all that's holding your vehicle from rolling away, that little tooth. Of course, I've got my nice little collection of snap rings here that I'm going to hang on the wall as a souvenir of the pain that I've gone through to make this video. Snap rings are kind of like women. You can't do with them, but you can do without them. So here's a quick exploded diagram of what's inside of the transmission. We've got our clutches A and B at the front, and then we've got E, C, and D near the back of the transmission. There's 4 planetary gear sets in here with the ring gears in green, the planet carriers in blue, and the red ones are the sun gears. Now by slowly engaging and disengaging these clutches here, you can change gears to achieve different gear ratios by allowing one set of planetary gear sets to rotate while the other set is held steady. Let's take a look at the power flow during first gear here. So we've got our A and B brakes engaged, as well as clutch C. This means that anything in blue here is going to be stationary with the transmission casing. The input shaft is going to bring in power over here and rotate this set here, clutch D, which is in turn going to rotate the sun gear and the planet carrier, and that's what's going to rotate the output shaft. Pretty simple. We're just using one planetary gear set at the back here to provide that gear ratio. Let's take a look at how power is translated through fourth gear here. You can see we've got brake B, clutches E and D engaged. Now when you engage E and D, essentially you're taking this entire third planetary gear set and fourth planetary gear set, and those are all going to rotate here at the same speed to the output shaft. Looking at the input shaft here, we've got the input power going to rotate planetary gear number 2, which in turn is going to rotate the sun gear for planetary gears number 1 and 2. That's going to rotate the planet carrier for the first planetary gear set. Remember, its ring gear is held in place by the brake B. The planet carrier is then going to transfer its power through this long drum over here to the ring of the final planetary gear set, and that's how you get this entire green section here to turn at the same speed. So here we've got the guts of the transmission laid out here. Let's dive in and see how it works. So looking from the front here, we've got our A brake, and that's splined to the oil pump housing over here. Here we've got this first ring gear and its brake over here, brake B. That's going to be splined to the transmission housing. Here's our first planetary gear set. This is going to be splined to this giant barrel that goes towards the back of the transmission on the last planetary gear set. You can see its sun gear here is shared between these two. The next planetary gear set here is splined to the next barrel, which is nestled inside of here, and then we have clutches E and C, which are nestled further inside of this last barrel over here. Finally, at the back here, we have the last planetary gear set before its planet carrier feeds the output shaft. So let's take a quick look at how this planet carrier works. You essentially have 3 pieces. You have the ring gear here, which is internally teethed. Then we have this planet carrier over here that has these 4 small little planet gears on it. That's going to be toothed to both the ring gear and the sun gear, which is this one that fits in between. Now these 3 pieces together here form the basis of your planetary gear set, in which one of these have to be held stationary. One is your input and one is your output. So for example, if the clutch that's attached here is locked up against the transmission casing, this is my input here and this planet carrier is now my output. Well, I have to rotate this, and you can see I have to rotate it a lot faster to get the planet carrier to turn. And that gives me an underdrive situation where I'm multiplying torque. The RPMs have to increase for the engine, but the output on the wheels are pretty slow. So now let's say I want a different gear ratio. Well, all I have to do is change which one's my input and my output. So for example, let's say the ring gear is now my output, the planet carrier is now locked, and my sun gear is the input. I'm going to rotate this, and you'll see that once again there is a gear multiplication here, but in addition it's spinning in the opposite direction, and that's ideal for a reverse. Now the final scenario will be having the sun gear stationary, the ring gear as my input, and the planet carrier as my output. If you watch these little 2 knots here and this little dot here, as I rotate, you can see they actually are rotating at a different speed. The 2 notches are still over here, and this means that this has to rotate faster than the output over here. Now each one of these planetary gear sets has 6 combinations of gear ratios that you can actually use, but just switching inputs and outputs doesn't really happen in transmission, so it's more like 3. Now this transmission has 4 planetary gear sets for a total of 8 forward gear ratios, and of course 1 reverse. And you can see by nestling these together, you can multiply gear ratios in order to achieve either underdrive or an overdrive scenario. And in this case, 8 gears is really here for fuel economy. Now in order to get one of these planetary gear sets to stop spinning, you have to use these clutches. Now these clutches here have a friction disc, and these are splined internally, which is going to connect to this piece over here. And then we have the steel band over here, which is splined externally, and that's going to either connect to the transmission's casing, or in this case to the barrel over here. Now normally when the piston is not applying any force, these clutches here are just soaked in transmission fluid and are free to rotate relative to each other. When hydraulic force is applied, these clutches are going to lock together with hydraulic pressure, and that's going to either force the part to rotate or force the part to stop against the transmission housing, and that's how you get one of these to stop or to engage as your input or output. And this one here is the piston for brake B, and it's going to be pushing up against those clutches in order to stop it from moving against the transmission casing. This giant thing here is the return spring for it, so that it pushes the piston back into its release condition when the hydraulic fluid is released. As you can imagine, the shifts have to happen fairly quickly, so these clutches have to lock up and unlock fairly quickly. There is going to be a little bit of overlap between all of the rest of the clutches engaging and disengaging while you're accelerating, and that's why you can naturally feel your shifts in these transmission compared to a continuously variable transmission. However, the downside to these transmissions is that these friction discs become a wear point, and you can see my other video on a failed transmission to see what it looks like all smoked up in here. Now this transmission control module sits inside of the transmission, which is encased in fluid completely. It's got its own little bus bars over here that it's going to connect to these solenoids over here to control everything. That also means if you are swapping transmissions or the valve body, you will have to get this guy programmed, because this is what controls everything as opposed to being in the ECM somewhere else. See, it's also got these input and output shaft speed sensors on it, and I'm also sure there's a transmission temperature sensor in there somewhere. Now this thing's pretty interesting. It's a giant accumulator cylinder. Now the transmission fluid pump is always going to be supplying it with pressure. You've got a release solenoid on the end here. Now during idle stop, the transmission fluid pump is no longer working, and when you let your foot off the brake, there's not going to be enough pressure there to engage your gear, so this is going to provide the pressure directly to the valve body in order to engage the correct solenoid and the correct clutches to put you into first gear. It's going to be a lot faster than waiting for that transmission pump to spin up and provide that pressure. You're going to notice that delay and that clunk when you go into first gear. This tries to mitigate that. Kind of like holding your breath and your brain is not getting enough oxygen. Let's see if I can break this apart to find any gold. Kind of reminds me of when I was a kid and me and my brother used to break apart all electronics just to like squish the capacitors and see what's inside. Well, that's the sucker right there, your transmission control module. The rest of it is just basically a giant bus board or a 3D circuit board. Now this here is the valve body, and it's basically the brains of the transmission. It's going to tell all the fluid where to go based on the solenoids here. So I'll just zip this off. You see, these are the solenoids here. Now these solenoids are basically giant switches that redirect fluid within the maze inside of here to tell it where to go. You can see at the end of them there, they have a little screen, and sometimes those could become clogged and cause transmission shifting problems. This here's where the manual valve is going to hook up to tell it when it's in park. Alright, so after a lot of prying, you can pop these guys out. And you can see that there's these little springs, and there's some balls in here. These are little check balls. So looking inside the valve body here, you can see it's basically a giant maze. Here's where the transmission fluid is going to be sucked up from the transmission filter. It's going to find its way through this maze over to this bank over here where all these solenoids hang out, and that's going to direct where the fluid pressure is going to go to the appropriate clutch through this maze over here where it's going to bolt up to the transmission. And here's a look inside the transmission casing where the valve body butts up to. That fluid is then going to be sent through these little channels over here to the appropriate clutches living inside of here or over here, and that'll engage them or disengage them. Let's see if I can take apart this transmission pump. You're supposed to use a press for this. So this here is actually the return spring for this piston that's inside of here. That's your brake clutch A. Alright, so this is the piston. You can see it's got seals on it. Now I can pop this housing off. Well, this is pretty cool. You've got a little chain drive over here. See, you've got the oil pump housing in here, and this is the actual pump. Whoa, that went flying. Pop off this spring here. Oh, there's a tiny little snap ring there. Whoa. So you can see this is a vane style pump. You get these small individual little veins over here, little slats, and that's what's going to take the intake fluid from this side here and provide a little bit of fluid flow as it rotates. The fluid's then going to be squeezed out the outlet and vice versa over on this side. It's kind of like a power steering pump. I sort of expected this to be more like an oil pump on the car with the gears that grind together. Let's see if I can open this up here. And you can see the individual little vanes over here. The centerpiece here is the rotor, and there's another snap ring holding that together, and the housing just an oblong shape. Last note on serviceability, this here is the magnets on the side of the pan here that you'd have to clean out. What really sucks though is that this doesn't even have a dipstick, and moreover it doesn't even have a damn drain port. So even though you have to get your fluid pump to get fluid in here, you don't even get to drain it out. Here's what the filter looks like. At least it's serviceable. In your vehicles you got to replace the pan and the filter. And that's a look inside the 8-speed automatic transmission and how it works. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos, just like this one. Yeah, I was kind of cheating. This was my notes I was using while disassembling.